Welcome. Welcome, everyone. So this is the end of the book of Shemot, the end of the book of Exodus. This week's parsha is called Pekudei. We find it in the book of Exodus, the last bit, chapter 38, verse 21 to chapter 40, verse 38. And the name of the parsha, Pekudei, means the recording of or the amounts of, and we find that in the very first verse of in Exodus 20:38-21. And again, this is the end of the parsha. And at this is also the end of the five parshiot that we've been talking about for the last number of weeks, where it's all about the Mishkan. So at this point now, Moshe is making an accounting of all of the materials, the gold, the silver, the copper, the that everybody donated for the making of the Mishkan. Bezalel, who was um, the primary artisan of the Mishkan, and Ahaliab, who was his assistant, and their assistants. They make the eight priestly garments that we spoke about: the apron, the breastplate, the cloak, the crown, the hat, the tunic, the sash, the breeches, according to the specifications that were communicated to Moshe in the Parsha of Titzaveh. So the Mishkan is completed. All of its components are brought together. Um, Hang on, Elizabeth, you have a question. What year did the Torah get split up into weekly portions? I don't know off the top of my head, but I will find out for you. Um, Interestingly, let me just make a
I,
note.
excuse me, I just read that this morning in the Mishnah Torah, and it said Ezra came up with that.
It could very well be the chapters and the verses actually are of Christian origin, which is why Parshiot seem to sometimes they start in the middle of a sentence, I'm in the middle of an idea, and so forth, in the middle of a chapter, because those were established by Christians, and but I'll find out when and how it got divided. It could very well have been in the time of Ezra. But in any case, the Mishkan's completed. All the parts are brought to Moshe, who erects it, puts everything together for the first time. And also with that special anointing oil that we talked about last week, that there was only ever one batch made, it was made by Moshe. He initiates Aaron, his brother, and Aaron's four sons into the priesthood. And a cloud appears over the Mishkan that signifies the divine presence that has come to dwell within it. We're going to talk about that a lot, but I just want to go back because I heard something fascinating this week that I did not share with you from last week's Parsha Vayakel. This comes from Rabbi Nir Manusi, who's here in Israel, and he talks about a verse you will find in Shemot in the book of Exodus, chapter 35, verse 26, and all the women whose hearts uplifted them with wisdom spun the goat. Now, that's literally what it says in the Hebrew, but most translations alter the original Hebrew and add the word hair because that makes it make more sense. The women spun the goat hair, right? Um, but that's not actually what it says. It literally says that the women spun the goats, period. Now, Rashi explains, based on a passage in the Talmud, that spun the goats means that they spun the goat's hair from off the back of the goat while it was still a living animal. They didn't, listen, I'm not a farmer or whatever. They didn't shear the goat before they started creating whatever they were. I always think of it as knitting, but whatever they were doing with the goat hair while it was still on the goat, which is obviously way harder to do than if it had been separated from the goat. Now, what's the lesson? This is the lesson that Rabbi Manusi said. He was talking about how women's spiritual service is connected and not detached from this world. I think we've spoken before about the concept of the classical Jewish star, which is two triangles. And in this context, I'll repeat it. The triangle that is broad on the top and goes to a point on the bottom, that represents the masculine spiritual energy, because what men do is they draw down holiness from above. Okay, so you can kind of picture that in an upside down triangle. The triangle that is flat on the bottom and goes up to a point, that is the feminine spiritual energy, or the way that women interact with the world, that elevates the elevates the material from um, from its sort of lowly place and brings it to a higher place. Okay, does that make sense? So, um, so what he was talking about is that women's spiritual service is connected, not detached from the world. So that a woman typically, let's say, might be listening to a Torah class while she is preparing for Shabbat, or holding a baby while she is studying over the phone. It's a different approach than men who generally shut themselves away from the world to study Torah. So that was his point, but I thought it was interesting, just this idea that the women were so skilled that they could spin um spin the goats. And if you look at your translation, any translation that you have, it almost certainly will say that they spun the goat hair, but that is actually not an accurate translation. I thought that was interesting. Okay, I want to transition into a deeper look at into the Mishkan, into the tabernacle. When the Mishkan and then the two holy temples that replaced it stood, the people could sense the presence of God much more than we can today. The Mishkan was a place of open miracles, and we talked about that a little bit last week. Um, but there's I try to imagine. So we have the special day of Tisha B'av that comes this year. It's in early August, but it's always sometime in the late summer. And on Tisha B'av, we mourn the destruction of the temples. This much you probably know. But since the year 70, almost 2000 years, the Jewish people and the nations have not had the spiritual benefit that comes from having a holy temple in the world. But when the Mishkan stood and when it was ultimately replaced by the two holy temples, except for the 70-year period in between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple, which is, by the way, when the Purim story happened, except for that, for all of that time, people had a physical place they could go to have an encounter with God. And we can't even really imagine what that means, because we don't have anything like that. So, um, this little piece that I'm going to teach you right now comes from a book called Shabbat Shalom by Sandra Bara. Some of you may know her. Um, Twice the Bible tells us that the Mishkan was created in order to contain God's presence, which is, of course, a concept we don't understand. But let me tell you where to look. In Shemot, in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verse 8, and they shall make me a sanctuary and I will dwell in their midst. That's one thing that it says there. And then later in Shemot, later in the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 34, you can look these up later. And the cloud covered the tent of meeting. This is almost the very end of the book of Shemot, and the glory of the Lord filled the Mishkan. Okay, so there's something going on. It is not just a physical building, but it is a destination where somehow God or part of God comes down into this world in a tangible way, in a way that people could access. Now, immediately following this last verse, the cloud that covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the Mishkan, we see something perplexing. The very next verse says, Moshe could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested upon it and the glory of the Lord filled the Mishkan. Okay, so if the Mishkan was intended as a place in part for Moshe to come and meet God in this world, and to receive instructions that he was supposed to pass on to the children of Israel, how do we understand the fact that he is either just like so overawed that he can't enter this sanctified space, or for whatever reason he couldn't enter? So there's one opinion that God spoke to him at the entrance of the Mishkan, And sometimes the translation of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, it might be called the tent of meeting. In Hebrew, we call it the Ohel Moed. But the Midrash offers, according to Sandra, another solution to this dilemma. That the Midrash notes that so Moshe is a tzaddik. He's a righteous man. He's done exactly what God has asked him to do in constructing the Mishkan with all of its detailed specifications. And if you've read any of the chapters that we have been studying for the last 5 weeks, there's a lot of detailed specifications, and he's done it all as quickly as possible. Now he's more like the producer, okay? Like he puts all the pieces together. I told you that there were other hands involved. The women were involved, and Betzalel was involved. And the thing that Moshe did himself was to blend this special anointing oil, but he's overseeing this whole thing. He's collecting everything and making it all come together. Okay, so he's done his job and he's done it relatively quickly. And now that it's done, he's standing outside and he is so awed by the presence of God and he's hesitant to enter. So, what does God do? So, for this, if we look ahead just a few verses, we actually have to jump to the very beginning of the next book, the third book of the 5 books of Moses, which is called in Hebrew Vayikra or Leviticus. And it says in Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1, and he called, meaning God, called to Moshe, and the Lord spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So the Midrash connects these two. The end of the book of Exodus, Moshe's standing there, and he's sort of paralyzed with with awe, with reverence, not able to move, with the beginning of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, into one story, which is um, portraying now God as a gracious host who recognizes what Moshe has done for him, okay, in constructing this house. And it depicts Moshe as a humble and a righteous servant who is hesitating to enter this house that he's just overseen the building of out of awe for God and God's presence. And so, God, recognizing his hesitation, he's beckoning him to enter. He's inviting him in because the Mishkan represents a balance between intimacy and distance. So, God's presence, if you could imagine, um, if you could, um, if you could imagine God's presence, like we sometimes have the experience, it might be fleeting, but we do sometimes have the experience of being in the presence of God. But this is like an all-encompassing, it's so hard for me to articulate or even to imagine what it is like to know without a shadow of a doubt that you are literally physically in the presence of God in this world, because this world is a very material world, it's a very low level world, it's a very um materialistic, did I say that, physical materialistic world, but the Mishkan represents the intersection between these two, okay? Between the intimacy of being in God's presence and the distance between us as mere mortals and the omnipresent God. So God's presence creates awe, and it also establishes a boundary between God and us, because only a few are actually ever allowed into the sacred space of the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the inner sanctum sanctorium. When Moshe enters this space, because he's one of the few people that's able to do that, he does it on behalf of all of the nation of Israel. So the Mishkan is a place from which God calls to his nation, making it possible for people to become close to him. The place is created by God's instruction because God realized that we needed access. We needed a way to feel his presence among us. And when we get to the stage where we hesitate because we are so overwhelmed by the power of God, that's when God invites us. That's the first verse from actually next week's parsha, when God invites us in. So there's an interesting dynamic there. This next piece is a couple of sort of life lessons from the Parsha that come from the book I told you about a couple weeks ago called Growth Through Torah by Rabbi Zelig Pliskin. And I want to share two of them with you. They are from parts of this Parsha, but it goes beyond that. So I mentioned to you in the summary that after being told to anoint Aaron, Moshe was told in reference to the four sons of Aaron. Here I'm in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shemot, chapter 40, verse 15. And you shall anoint them as you have anointed their father. So now God's talking to Moshe and he's saying you should anoint these four sons just like you did their father, your brother, so that they may serve me as Kohanim, as priests. And this shall be that their appointment shall remain for them an everlasting kahuna. Kahuna is like a priesthood throughout their generations. So we know even until today, men who are descended from the line of Aaron or his four sons are considered Kohanim, and that has relevance in Jewish life today. Now, Rabbi Pliskin wants us to know that everybody, even somebody on the level of Moses, can fall prey to envy, but can also overcome it. So Rabbi Meir Simcha Cohen, who died in 1926, relatively modern rabbi, explained that when Moshe was asked to anoint his brother Aaron, he was able to do so with a full heart. Because even though Moshe is the younger brother, Moshe himself has a very important role to play as the leader of the Israelites. And he's happy that his brother also got a leading role as the high priest. But now we're talking about Aaron's sons. Moshe has two sons of his own, and they are not going to succeed him as leaders. So it's easy to understand that he might have felt envious of his brother, because now the kahuna, the priesthood, is now forever and ever um, gifted to his brother and his brother's male descendants, and Moshe doesn't have um, any promise that his sons are going to inherit any positions of leadership, and in fact, they don't. Okay, so nevertheless, according to Rabbi Meir Simcha HaKohen, Moshe was commanded to do so with the same wholehearted joy with which he anointed his brother. And what does the Torah say in the very next verse? Shemot, Exodus, chapter 40, verse 16. Thus Moshe did, according to all that the Lord had commanded him, so he did. It's hard to imagine someone on the level of Moses needing a special commandment to overcome envy. But we see from here that even the greatest person needs to internalize attitudes that will help them avoid envy. And in addition, we see that it's possible to feel joy and enthusiasm for someone else's success, even when they have something that you lack. So there's actually a Yiddish word for this concept that is a Torah value. It's called to forgin, which means not to begrudge or to withhold a favor from somebody for some petty reason. So if somebody achieves something that you do not have, and that you wish you had for yourself, to forgive means to be happy for them, regardless of your own circumstances. So let's say you're a young woman and you're trying to get pregnant and you're having trouble getting pregnant and your friend gets pregnant. You could feel envious. That would be a natural human reaction. But in this case, the Torah value, the higher value, is to forgive, is to not begrudge her pregnancy, um, because even though you still don't have what you need. As a matter of fact, there's this interesting idea in Jewish life that if we want something or we need something from God, one of the practical things that people are often advised to do is to pray for somebody who needs that exact same thing. So, Natalie, you knew I was going to say that, right? Yes. So going back now, I don't know, most of us are probably past the stage where we're having children, but um, to pray for somebody else who is having trouble conceiving or who wants to conceive, when that's your own heart's desire, is an extension of that. So I think that's an interesting Jewish value. Another one that comes from this parsha is the concept of focusing on on doing God's will in whatever we do, that we are doing God's will. So um, going back to Shemot, to the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 16, thus Moshe did according to all that the Lord had commanded him, so he did. Moshe's motivation in everything that he did for the Mishkan was for God's honor, even though he personally was going to benefit, because what he was creating was a space from which God would speak to him. He wasn't motivated by his own honor. He focused solely on doing the will of Hashem. And that can be an especially difficult task and challenge, to do something for which you will benefit, but still maintain the pure motivation of doing it out of service to God. Because the more sacred your work is, the greater the importance of having elevated thoughts and motivations about it. So there's a story that's told about Rabbi Yecheskel Abramsky, who was the head of the London Beit Din. He made Aliyah in 1951. He died in 1976. You don't have to remember that. I'm just telling you, he was a contemporary rabbi. And he had a colleague, Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Schulsinger, who was a rabbi in Israel, who died in 2010. And he said, every time I go to deliver a Torah lecture, I have in mind that I am going to serve the Almighty with the mitzvah of teaching Torah. At times, to think these thoughts sincerely is even more difficult than any other aspect of giving the lecture. What is he saying? I have to, I have to study, I have to prepare the lecture and distill it. I have to give over the lecture. But the hardest thing for me is to do that, not because people will say, I'm putting words in his mouth. He passed away, 50 years ago, but not to do it because people will admire me, admire my level of learning, but because God gave us the responsibility to teach whatever Torah we have. And that is like that pure service of God. So whatever we do for Hashem, even if we get honor for it, it should come from a place of humility, because um, ultimately we're all working for the boss. So those are the two lessons from Rabbi Pliskin that I want to share with you. Now I want to turn our attention to the month of Nisan, because it says in our parsha, in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shemot, chapter 40, verse 2, on the day of the first month, on the first of the month, you shall set up the Mishkan of the tent of meeting. So this is God telling Moshe. Moshe is commanded to set up the Mishkan on the first day of the first month. And this, in biblical language, is Nisan, the month of Nisan. And Parsha Pekudei is generally read close to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day, the first of the month of Nisan. This year, in fact, Pekudei will be read in shuls around the world on Shabbat, which is the last day of the month of Adar. And the next day, Sunday, March 30th, is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So I want to look at this concept of the month of Nisan a little bit, because it plays a role in our parsha, and it's also the time where we are, because on Sunday it will be Nisan. The month of Nisan always comes in the spring. It is a time of rebirth, and it is associated with the concept of redemption. So on the first of Nisan, what we call the Shekhinah, God's imminent presence, comes to dwell among the children of Israel on the day that the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is inaugurated. Now, the book of Exodus, if you think of all of what we've done over the last couple of months, the book of Exodus starts in a state of exile. The Israelite people, well, they're not really a people yet. The children of Israel are in Egypt. They are dealing with slavery, followed by the plagues that afflicted the Egyptians. Then the light of redemption begins to shine on the first of Nisan, when God says to Moshe and Aaron, and this is going back to the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 2, this month shall be to you the head of months, to you it shall be the first of the months of the year. Okay. So then so that's sort of the first the first commandment that God gives is to mark Nisan as the beginning of the year. After narrating the drama of leaving Egypt, the splitting of the sea, the giving of the Torah, the sin of the golden calf, and all the consequences that devolve from that, the book of Exodus concludes with the details of this Mishkan. And then on the first day of Mishkan, the Shekhinah comes to dwell in this completed tabernacle, and God calls to Moshe to teach him the commandments that relate what's coming up next, the commandments that relate to the sacrifices that are to be offered in this new portable sanctuary. Now, the the rabbis explain a verse in Shir Hashirim, which is Song of Songs, in terms of God's calculation of time and its connection to this theme of redemption in Nisan. In Shir Hashirim, in Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 8, it says this: the sound of my beloved, behold, he is coming, skipping over the mountain, jumping over the hills. Now, there's a rabbi quoted in the Talmud, Rabbi Yehoshua, who lived after the destruction of the Second Temple, and he died in the year 131 CE, so about 1900 years ago. He says, the voice of my beloved, that is God speaking about Moshe. So Moshe is the beloved, and God is talking about his voice. What does this have to do with Nisan? What does it have to do with the book of Exodus? When Moshe told the people of Israel that they are going to be redeemed in Nisan, they said to him, how is that possible? God told us that we're going to be slaves for 400 years. And that is a reference to Bereshit, to the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 13. I'll just read it to you in English. And he, meaning God, said to Avram, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. But Moshe is coming to the people and saying, you are going to be redeemed in Nisan. It's only 210 years after that. So how does Moshe answer? He says, since he, meaning God, desires that you be redeemed, he pays no heed to your calculations. Rather, he skips over the mountains, meaning Hashem skips over your calculation in your human way of thinking about time, and he's telling you that in this month you will be redeemed. Now, I've heard three answers regarding how do we understand that in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, God says that the oppression, the enslavement will last for 400 years, and it ended after only 210 years. That may be a question that you yourself have had. So I've heard three answers, and I'm going to just review them with you. Number one is that the oppression was so harsh that the Egyptians treated the Israelites so harshly that it's as if 210 years was the equivalent amount of suffering that they would have experienced over 400 years. That's one reason I've heard. Another idea is that a negative prophecy, which 400 years of oppression and enslavement certainly sounds like a negative prophecy, can be changed. And the third is I think one of the more interesting ones because it shows us how God is not like us. God doesn't think the way we think. And that is God took those extra 190 years of hardship and sprinkled them throughout Jewish history instead of concentrating them in one block. So every subsequent horror that was inflicted on the Jewish people was an extension or was a piece of those missing 190 years. So think of pogroms and expulsions and the Holocaust and our war right now with Islamic Jihad, all of the tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people. Some people explain it as the remaining 190 years broken up throughout history. I thought that was really fascinating. Today, actually, well, it's always been there, but today it's very relevant because of this. There's a short prayer that is said after the Torah reading in the morning Torah service on I don't know if it's said on Shabbat, but on Mondays and Thursdays. And it's actually turned into a popular song. The song is called Achenu, which literally means our brothers. And so while we are waiting for our hostages, the remaining 59 hostages dead and alive, it has become very relevant. I'm actually making myself a note to send you a link to the song. I'm gonna just tell you what the prayer says, because every morning when I put on my number, today is day 536, and when I actually say this prayer every day. It's very short. I am thinking about the hostages. This is the prayer. As for our brothers and sisters, the whole house of Israel, who are given over to trouble or captivity, whether they abide on the sea or on dry land. May the all-present have mercy on them and bring them forth from trouble to grief, from darkness to light. And I always think of the tunnels and the situation in which they find themselves, from subjugation to redemption, now, speedily, and soon, and let us say Amen. That's called Achenu. So it's an old prayer that's been in the prayer book for a very long time, but it has particular relevance now. Also, in terms of Nisan, it's mentioned in the Talmud in one opinion that the three patriarchs of the Jewish people, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were all born and passed away in the month of Nisan. And we've already talked about, I find that very interesting, but in the Bible, Nisan is always the first month. The names of the months, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, all of that, um, those came later and are of Babylonian origin, but the Bible calls them the first month, the fifth month, whatever. Whenever the Bible does that, it is counting from Nisan. Okay. Now, here's something that, Elizabeth, you want to say something?
No, I'm sorry.
Can you mute yourself? Because, yeah, there we go. Um, Now, it might be confusing to those of you that know that Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. How could Nisan be the beginning of the year? And Elizabeth's obviously having a little technical difficulty. How can Nisan be the beginning of the year when Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year? So there's actually four Jewish New Years. I'll just review them very quickly with you. The first is the first of Tishrei, which is Rosh Hashanah. And we find this mentioned in Vayikra in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, verse 24. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the seventh month, because that's biblical language, that means the seventh month from Nisan. On the first of the month, it shall be a Sabbath for you, a remembrance of Israel through the shofar blast, a holy occasion. So that's a reference to Rosh Hashanah. Nisan, the first of Nisan, I told you already, we find in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 2. This month shall be to you the head of the months. To you it shall be the first of the months of the year. It's also what we call the new year for kings. So when the Bible is calculates how long a king has been kinging, how long a king has been in uh, the king, it doesn't count. Like, let's say that on July 1st the king became the king. So when it becomes I'm using an English date, but when it becomes the first of Nisan, that's the end of his first year. If he was appointed, let's say on the 15th of Adar, the first of Nisan would mark the beginning of his second year. Okay, that's the way the counting goes for kings, for trees, and for cattle. The third of the New Year's in the way Jews mark time is the 15th of Shvat, which is the new year for trees, which we call it Tu B'Shvat, and that's how we count the age of a tree for the purposes of Orla, which means we're not allowed, if it's a fruit-bearing tree, we're not allowed to use the fruit of the tree for the first 3 years. So where do you count the years? So every year on Tu B'Shvat, the tree becomes a year older. So let's say that you have planted a vineyard of apple trees and it's taken you a couple of months I don't know how long it takes to plant apple trees, but let's just say, then whenever you planted them, on the following Tu B'Shvat, those trees turn a year old. Okay. And then the following Tu B'Shvat and the following Tu B'Shvat. So this is still very much an issue. If I happen not to have any real land to speak of where I could plant things, but if I were to plant a lemon tree or some tree here, I would not be able to eat of the fruit of it until after the third year, going by this new year for trees. And the first of Elul is the new year for cattle, which determines what year an animal was born. That's the least important. But that is how it can be confusing for people. The first two, Rosh Hashanah and the first of Nisan, are the most important of the New Years, but you probably have also heard of Tu B'Shvat. You may not have ever heard of the first of Elul. The main holiday of Nisan is, of course, Pesach, Passover, which is a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of this event in Jewish history. We call it in Hebrew Yetziat Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim means Egypt, and Yetziat means exiting from. So the Exodus from Egypt, which is also the name of this book. So where do we see this in Jewish life? It's the story of the biblical books of Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, Exodus, Leviticus. What is something in Deuteronomy? What is the English for the Numbers? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Aspects of the Exodus from Egypt, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, are remembered also on Pesach and also on Shavuos when we receive the Torah, and on Sukkot when we remember the years of wandering in the desert. It's mentioned in the Shema, which is the central Jewish prayer. It's mentioned in the Friday night Kiddush and the blessing over wine. It's mentioned during morning prayers. It's mentioned in the grace after meals. It is everywhere in Jewish life. The remembrance of this particular redemption. Now, when Mashiach comes, the understanding is that that redemption, the final redemption, will overshadow the redemption of Nisan, of Pesach in this time, but we're not there yet. So right now, this is like our model for what redemption looks like. This is such a fascinating idea. This special spiritual potential of Nisan is redemption. So when we celebrate Passover, when we celebrate Pesach, and we are remembering the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt didn't just happen to fall in the month of Nisan, and that's why we mark it on that day. It happened because Nisan is a month of redemption. And the Exodus from Egypt is the major redemption of Jewish history, as I just said before, the final redemption. So it's not like a simple, my birthday is June 29th. Okay. So I happen to be born on June 29th. That's, I'm sure it has mystical and at least the Hebrew date, but that's when I was born. We don't mark Passover because it's the anniversary of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. The Exodus from Egypt happened because the spiritual energy of Nisan is redemption. Okay, a few more things about Nisan. I find that really fascinating. There's a strong custom that during the first few days of Nisan, we donate money for the poor of our community so that they can buy flour for matzah to use at their Seder. This is called Kimcha de Pisca, which is Aramaic for flour for Pesach. Also in Nisan, the Shabbat before Passover is called Shabbat Hagadol, which literally means the Great Sabbath, which is in part in memories of the miracles that God performed for the Israelites before they left. So this first Shabbat is their first Shabbat of freedom while they were still in Egypt. So there was a period of time before they left Egypt when they were no longer slaves, okay, while the plagues were going on and so forth. And the 10th of Nisan, I remember they left on the 15th of Nisan. On the 10th of Nisan was such a Shabbat. And on that day, they were given the commandment to prepare a lamb, which was a god in Egypt, 4 days before it was to be sacrificed. And the miracle was that the Egyptians who worshipped lambs as gods were unable to do anything to stop them from slaughtering the Egyptian gods. The 10th of Nisan is also important for two other main reasons. One is because it is the anniversary of the death of Miriam, who died after 39 years in the desert. So she almost made it, but didn't quite make it. And some people have a custom of fasting on that day in remembrance of Miriam. Also, on the 10th of Nisan, in the 40th year, so now Moshe is out of the picture. Yehoshua, Joshua, is the leader of the Israelites, and he is bringing them into the land of Israel through the Jordan River. And the Jordan River parts so that the children of Israel can cross into the land of Israel for the first time. And we find this in Yehoshua, in the book of Joshua, chapter 4, verse 19. And the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Okay, that is the 10th of Nisan. There's one more special association with Nisan, and that's a mitzvah that can be fulfilled only once a year, anytime during the month of Nisan. We recite a blessing upon seeing a fruit tree in bloom. Now, many people will go to visit perhaps a botanical garden during this time so that they can avail themselves of the opportunity to observe this mitzvah if they don't have fruit trees around them. In Israel, I have seen in communities where I have lived that people will post where there's a blossoming fruit tree so that you can go and make the blessing. I have had neighbors who have fruit trees that will like make a sign with the blessing and attach it to their tree, so that people coming by can say this blessing. This is the blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made nothing lacking in his world and created it in it goodly creatures and goodly trees to give mankind pleasure. That's the blessing in English. The blessing is said just once a year, the first time that you see a blossoming fruit tree. Now, I think Ada's not with us today, but in Australia and in other countries in the Southern Hemisphere where the trees blossom 6 months later during the month of Elul and Tishrei, the blessing can be said at that time for people who for whom this is not springtime in their Pearl, is that true for you? Are you going into winter now? Okay. All right. Um, so speaking of Pearl, a few weeks ago, she asked me to speak about the Havdalah ceremony. The Havdalah ceremony is the ceremony that it's a brief ceremony that's done at home at the end of Shabbat before you enter the weekday. And I didn't respond because I really had to think about it. And I apologize that I didn't give you a response, but I didn't forget about it because it's a very complicated issue. There's a lot of the symbolism of the Havdalah ceremony has to do with things that are only relevant for Jews who are fully obligated in all of the prohibitions of Shabbat. But I learned something today about a distinction, and I want to share that with you. Right now, because of how things are changing, questions are arising now with non-Jews involved in doing what, for lack of a better way of describing it, Jewish things that have never been asked before. And it's a whole area of halacha, it's a whole area of Jewish law that requires being addressed by the rabbis of today. And at some point, this goes way beyond like the laws for Noahides. It's I can imagine that at some point there will be books and books published about um, about non-Jews and how they can participate in a way that is consistent with Jewish law and appropriate for them. So some of you may have seen that I made a video a couple months ago that Bretta asked me to make about how Christian women could begin to approach Shabbat. And I wanted to add something to that because some of my colleagues, we had a guest for Shabbat who works at Ir David, the city of David, and he reminded me that one of the things that he and his colleagues, and now I am going to share with you, is that you can easily do and easily add to your Shabbat experience is to drink Israeli wine. Um, if you live in an area where there is a kosher community, like I don't know, anywhere in your area where there's a kosher store or whatever, even if not, you can go into a liquor store and ask them if they have any wine from Israel. Um, there are places online that it can be ordered if you are a wine drinker. And it's a way of connecting your Shabbat with the land of Israel that it's really, and there's like zero issues in terms of Jewish law with that. So I just offer that to you if you are a person who marks Shabbat in your home, that to have some wine from the land of Israel is very, it's a very significant way of doing it. But okay, I also learned this week from Israel 365, which is so is there anybody who doesn't know what Israel 365 is? Okay, they're publishing a book written by an Orthodox rabbi by the name of Rabbi Eli Michel, who's on their staff, um, about Christians doing Shabbat. And he and I were talking about this, and I asked him this question that Pearl asked me about Havdalah. And he made this distinction that makes so much sense to me and that I had never thought about before. And it has to do with blessings. Okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, blessings, there are kind of two kinds of blessings in Jewish life. One is general blessings, like the blessings that we make on food. So, for example, um, before we eat, let's say, a piece of fruit, we will say, it sounds better in Hebrew, but we're saying, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the tree." Okay. Um, if you eat a cookie or a pretzel or something that's made from grains, the blessing that you say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates various kinds of sustenance." Or let's take a Havdalah example, blessings over the spices, which is one of the symbols of Havdalah. The blessing is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates various kinds of spices." Or the blessings over nature. So if you see lightning or hear thunder, there are blessings that we make. Um, so the blessing over lightning is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who performs the work of creation." And if there's the blessing over thunder is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, whose power and might fill the world." Now, this is the opinion that I heard today. It is fine for non-Jews to say these because what are you saying? They are general praises of the God that we share. You're blessing God for creating this, for creating that, for being involved in creation, for there's no problem even to use the same formula that Jews use to make these blessings. And so the blessing in Havdalah over the spices is an example of one that there's no issue with that. However, there are kinds of blessings that only Jews say because they include this phrase, Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us, such as the blessing for candlelighting on Shabbat. We say, I'm going to say it in English, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to kindle the lights of the holy Sabbath." Or there's a blessing that I say every morning before studying Torah. "Blessed are you, Hashem our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah." Now, I don't want to um, I don't want to misrepresent. Non-Jews should not make this category of blessings because they're not true. The behavioral commandments were addressed, in this case, exclusively to the nation of Israel, but that doesn't mean that non-Jews can't light Shabbat candles or they can't study Torah. It just means that they shouldn't say the same bracha, the same blessing that Jews say because they were not specifically commanded. Is that distinction clear? Okay. Having said that, so now, if you'd like, I didn't prepare it for now because we're almost out of time, but I can do a review of the Havdalah ceremony, the components of the Havdalah ceremony, the symbolism of the Havdalah ceremony for that would be appropriate for non-Jews. Okay. So that's Pekudei, Nisan, blessings. That's what I prepared today, and we have a few minutes. And so, if you would like to open your mic and ask a question, Bretta, I saw that you made a comment, but it was hidden by on my screen. I don't know if you write to me after and tell me which biblical passage you're looking for. I'm happy to tell you. And Natalie, you want to say something?
No, I just put it on because it's so hard to put it on. So if I wanted to add something.
In
No,
case you think of something.
yeah, just one thing. My birthday is on the 1st of Nisan.
Mazal tov.
Ah, amazing. So I had my secular one, but now my Jewish one is coming.
So if any of you, by the way, don't know how to figure this out and would like to tell me, you can text me, tell me what your English birthday is and what time of day. It's important to know whether you were born before sunset or after sunset, and I will tell you what your Hebrew birthday is. Many years ago, there was in the city that we used to live in called Baltimore, there was a festival every it was during Labor Day weekend, early September, called the Jewish Festival, or the Jewish American Festival. And there was this one booth. It was actually, I mean, I didn't know very much about Judaism at the time. This is going back many, many years. But there was a booth that Chabad was um, offering calendars for the new Jewish year because it was early September. So Rosh Hashanah, which is one of the four New Year's in the Jewish calendar, was coming. And so they were giving away these calendars and they offered to look up your Hebrew birthday. So you would tell them your English birthday. And at the time, I thought this was like such a great party trick. I had I had no idea how they did it, but now I know how to do it. So if you're interested and you don't know and you don't know how to figure it out, just text me your English birthday and it will be my pleasure to tell you when your Hebrew birthday falls. Okay. Anybody else? Pearl, do you want to say anything? I see you unmuted yourself.
Thanks very much for mentioning the Havdalah. I've actually written a book. It's a booklet. It's a 12-page booklet to teach people on the same path as I am. Remember, I said to you that I'm second generation Messianic, or, Torah observant to a certain extent, if you could call it that. So I've grown up my entire life keeping Sabbath, obviously not in the way that a Jew is obligated to keep Sabbath, but observing the Sabbath as the holy day. So I'm helping people on this path as best I can who are only starting to come into it because I've known it my whole life. Eating according to Leviticus 11 and, all these kind of things. So I'm always trying to make resources available for people. So I've written this booklet. I've had the rabbi from our shul has actually proofread it. Now, the shul that I attend to, you'll probably be very surprised by this, but we're non-Jews and Jews who worship side by side. It's actually an Orthodox Ashkenazi shul, and they allow people like us who are Torah observant to worship with them. So that's where I attend. And my rabbi has actually proofread my Havdalah booklet, but I haven't sent it for printing or, to be finalized because I was waiting to see if I could hear from you and just glean from what you have to say in case I want to change anything last minute before it goes in for printing.
Can I ask you a sensitive question?
Yeah, sure. I would like you to.
Yeah, how much in what you've written and in the way that you practice Havdalah, how much is there Jesus slash Yeshua symbolism or mentioning in your understanding of the ceremony?
There are one or two references, but even at our shul, there's a distinct difference between Jew and Gentile. We do actually recognize that we're two separate people worshiping the same God in essence. So I do make it clear to people that this is not a Havdalah booklet for a purely Orthodox Jew, but that it's a Havdalah booklet with all the Jewish tradition, but with mention of Yeshua. And if that, it's not for a Jewish person, it's for people like myself.
Right.
We've moved from the richness of the tradition, but we know that we're not Jews.
Right. Okay. All right. So I probably don't want to see that, but if anybody else is interested, if not, I'll just teach this to Pearl individually. But if anybody else would like to know from a purely Jewish perspective, because that's really all I can offer, um, I'm happy to describe the Havdalah ceremony with all of its symbolism and so forth, much of which I'm sure you already know. Anybody else? Yeah.
One quick thing. When we worship at shul, there is a difference between the way we say the blessings. Our rabbi actually says the blessing in the Jewish way for people like for instance, when we've had lunch for grace after meals, we don't say who brought us out of the land of Egypt, because I wasn't brought out of the land of Egypt. The Jews say that, and we say something alternative. We have to say something slightly different. So it kind of, we're together, but we understand that there's a distinct difference.
Yeah, I think that at some point, as redemption continues to unfold, that these categories that we have now, which are not always so clean, will become much more understandable. I um, I appreciate that um, that there is sensitivity to that. And we're not trying to like brush everybody with the same paint. It's still it's a very, very, very sensitive area.
It,
And yeah, I know you know that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, Shali, you want to say something?
I just have a question about when we're on the topic of Shabbat and non-Jews celebrating Shabbat, because Shabbat when I see it as a commandment that or God gave right at the creation story because he
Right.
rested on the seventh day. Now, I've heard from number of Orthodox Jews that not only do they not expect non-Jews to observe Shabbat, but they shouldn't. Also, the Noahites shouldn't. I mean, is that what's your opinion on that?
Okay.
Because Isaiah 56 also says those who profane the Shabbat in the end of days, Jews and Gentiles
Right.
alike, will be so.
Okay. So Pearl is describing her community, which is an evolving entity that did not used to exist, anything like that. We are in a time where a lot of Jews misunderstand this. So it happens that this book that Rabbi Michelle is putting out is specifically guidelines for how non-Jews can observe the spirit of Shabbat. Now, here's the distinction. We talked, I think it was last week, about the 39 categories of what we call in Hebrew malacha, creative effort, that parallel the effort that was required to construct the Mishkan, right? We talked about that. There's a whole set of laws that we Jews call keeping Shabbat that are not only not obligatory on the rest of the nations, but they are forbidden according to Jewish law to the extent that, let's say somebody's going through a process of conversion and they're trying to learn how to do Shabbat, they are able to have a Shabbat that looks a whole lot like a Jewish Shabbat, but they have to violate one of the laws in order to demonstrate that they understand there's a distinction because they are not yet Jews. Okay. So we're now in a time where, and this is sort of what I started this section with that you're picking up on, new questions are being asked that were never asked before. So Shabbat used to be a dividing line between Jews and the rest of the world. But if you are biblically accurate as exactly what you said, Shabbat is actually Shabbat for the whole world. What it looks like in your home is going to be somewhat different than what it looks like in my home, but that does not mean that um, that non-Jews should have nothing to do with Shabbat and that they should just go and, I don't know, go to the park or go to the beach or go shopping or whatever it is people do on Saturday, which is a word I hardly ever use, because there is value in the rest of the world. And this is part of the messianic process for the rest of the world to acknowledge that Shabbat is a set aside day, going all the way back, as you said, to the seventh day of creation. It's just that it looks different in a Jewish home and in a non-Jewish home, somewhat different. But for example, what I just said about bringing a bottle of wine from the land of Israel onto your Shabbat table, if that's something that you do, well, I do that too, right? The video that I made was all kinds of suggestions of things that I also do. Yeah, okay, Kedem grape juice. I don't actually know if that's from Israel though. I used to drink Kedem grape juice in America. So I can't hear you, Pearl, because you're muted.
Sorry, we have a place where all the Jews live, and it's a big, big, big shop called Kosher World. And this grape juice is imported from Israel. It's from Kosher World.
I would look closely at the label because there, I'll tell you, this is kind of interesting. That brand of grape juice in America is called Kedem. In Israel, it's called Geula. Um, the brand on it is it's called Geula. And so it is kind of interesting, but I don't know if it actually comes from Israel or if it's just sold in Israel.
Don't drink grape juice that comes from a Gentile. And if they're buying it at Kosher World, then it's pretty much.
It's certainly kosher. It's 100% kosher. My question is, does it come from grapes that grew in the land of Israel? That I don't know.
Because we don't have those dark, extremely dark purple grapes
Right.
in our country. We've got like light purple, light red grape juice. We don't have that like dark,
Right.
dark, dark.
The same is true in Israel. Israeli grape juice is either white or it is usually a lighter. In fact, I'm not really sure what time it is. Oh, okay. We're almost out of time. I'll just finish with this story. We are out of time, and I'm going to finish with this story. We had some American students, as we often do, visiting our community for Shabbat, and I served Israeli grape juice, which I actually prefer, although my daughter really likes the stuff that Pearl just showed. And after Kiddush, they took a sip and they were like, "Ooh, this is like it's not as sweet um, as this Kedem grape juice, Israeli grape juice," and they did not prefer it, but it is a somewhat different flavor. Wait, Kathy, are you going to show us your grape juice bottle?
Yeah, I thought I'd check it out while we're online.
Okay, you can let me know because we're finishing. Does anybody have anything burning that they want to say? Helen, you unmuted yourself. Do you want to say something?
It says
Could you give me the
it's
title of
in
that?
America.
Sorry.
Sorry, Rick. Could you give me the title of the book written by Z65?
Yes and no. I don't know the title because it actually isn't out yet. It's
Oh,
Rabbi
okay.
Michelle sent me the introduction, where he was explaining and sort of partially he's explaining the rationale for the whole world to observe Shabbat in some way. When it is
Okay.
available, I absolutely will let you know, but
Thank you.
it's being edited or typeset or something
Yeah.
like that right now.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll just finish with Kathy telling us what's the definitive thing on Kedem grape juice.
Mine says Marlboro, New York, product of USA.
It'd be interesting, Pearl, if you just go look at your label and let me know what it says. Okay. All right. We're over time. I appreciate all of you staying with me. Good to see
Thank
you.
you
See you
so
next week, God
much.
willing. Pleasure. Bye, guys.